Which deceased person, if brought back to life, would be the most surprised to learn they became famous posthumously? Part 2. Stieg Larsson, who wrote The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo series. He was a dedicated, talented writer who, in life, never found great success. He became a best-selling author many times after his death. Had no idea he's dead. In his life, he was a political journalist. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo was published a year after he died. Just prior to his death, he had finally found a publisher who accepted his trilogy. He probably was psyched just to have his work published at all. Can't imagine he would have predicted it would turn into a major bestseller with multiple movie adaptations. Archduke Ferdinand. He was heir to one of the most powerful empires in the world. I don't think he'd be surprised to learn he was famous. Yeah, he was famous in his time, but I bet most people wouldn't have heard of him today if he wasn't assassinated. Anastasia, the most famous Romanov, and she was a young teenage girl who actually did nothing of note in her life, while her sisters, parents, and brother were more famous in their time. Is she really the most famous Romanov though? Maybe I can't see it clearly for being a history nerd, but surely Nicholas II, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great are all more famous? Van Gogh, I guess. He is an everyday name these days. He would be proud and shocked to see his influence. I think he'd be happier to see how his treatment changed the art world forever. The Basquiat movie summed it up pretty well. They ignored Van Gogh's genius, and now they never want to risk letting history repeat itself. Robert Johnson and his impact on music. Imagine going from selling a few hundred, or whatever, some say a few thousand or Terraplane Blues, but that's largely unsubstantiated, records to being the person behind an award-winning million seller 50 years after your death. Not to mention Clapton's cover album of some of his songs selling 500,000 on its own. That'd be surreal. The sad thing is, he may not have had to wait long for some recognition. Whether it would have lasted or not, or if not dying under mysterious circumstances would have impacted the legend to the point that there wouldn't been one, he was invited to play at Carnegie Hall, which would have really been something significant. Ignaz Semmelweis. He pioneered the idea that hand washing saves life and was the source of the name of the Semmelweis reflex, which is the tendency to reject new evidence or knowledge that contradicts established norms, because this idea was soundly rejected until after he died. How is this not higher? The dude literally invented hand washing for hygiene in medicine and was locked up in an asylum over it. Worth the research to see how far medicine has really come in such a short period of time, and also a good name to throw around for those coronavirus people who compare it to pre-1860 disease impacts. Nietzsche. I heard he was selling less than 100 copies of some of his books, and now he's known as one of the greatest philosophers ever. The man was ahead of his time. No. Nietzsche fully believed he would be recognized as great eventually. He considered himself to be ahead of his time, and people didn't recognize his greatness because he was too far ahead of his time. If anything, he'd be surprised he's not more famous. Some men are born posthumously. Arthur Conan Doyle would be severely pissed off. He'd be livid that no one knew he wrote other stories than Sherlock. I have an anthology of his vampire short stories. They're pretty good. Straight up Diogenes. The mad lad literally lived his life trying not to be important and ended up being one of the most popular people in history. But he became pretty famous. He was even visited by Alexander the Great. Allegedly, he asked Diogenes if there was anything he wanted from Alexander. He replied, "I'd have you stand out of my sun." The guy lived in a clay vine pot. Matthew Shepard. He was just a college kid that was tortured and beaten to death for being gay. I don't think he knew he'd be remembered for anything. This is the first person I thought of. If only he could see what the outrage at his death helped bring about. I doubt it would make up for any of the torture and pain, but it would hopefully at least make him smile at what the future holds for others who live in fear of being themselves. There's a photo being passed around of a fully nude black man as a prank which started at the beginning of the pandemic. Basically, people are sending a link to friends which looks like a local alert regarding quarantined areas nearby, and when you click it, you are faced with this huge hog. The image is pretty famous now, and a podcast I listened to tracked down the man's identity, and he passed away a long time ago. I'm pretty sure he'd be surprised at his posthumous fame. The photo prank has been going around for years, even before the pandemic. I've fallen victim multiple times. H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft would be one of those famous people who finally get a Twitter due to pressure from their fans and then immediately makes everyone hate them. Emily Dickinson. I'm surprised no one mentioned her yet. I can picture her eye twitching in consternation at the notion. William Shakespeare would be the type to try to play it cool, but you would hear him celebrating the second he thinks nobody's looking. Nah, more like willpower from something rotten. Edgar Allan Poe. He was fairly popular at the time. The Raven made him a household name and he was a respected literary critic. His financial difficulties were well divorced from his level of celebrity, that is, by the end of his life, at least. Ian Nasir. Bet he'd wish he just destroyed all that hate mail instead of letting it pile up in his house until it's rediscovered almost 4,000 years later. Fun fact? There is /fanfic based on those letters. Otzi the Iceman. As most everything in this world of ours would be wholly alien to him, including the modern concept of fame, he would be the most shocked. Egyptian mummies would be both horrified and comforted as their tombs have been plundered, but they are remembered and their bodies preserved, which is part of the religion. The mummies would probably be disturbed about that whole eating mummies fad though. My dad, because he's not dead yet. And he's not famous, but he's dying of cancer in a hospital right now, and no one can be with him because of the pandemic. Edit. He's gone now. I got to video chat with him before he left. He was scared of death, but mostly we spent time together the way he lived. We talked about my siblings, his children, me as a baby, the little things. God bless you, Dad. I'm glad you went peacefully. Jim Croce. If you don't know him, he wrote and performed the song Jim Hopper sang along to Season 3 of Stranger Things after telling Mike off, "Don't mess around with Jim." Jim died in a plane crash in 1973. He recorded 5 studio albums, but he was still a struggling musician who was taking part-time jobs to make ends meet. After he was killed, his albums went to number 1. Yes, this! Most of his fame was posthumous. I find Time in a Bottle to be particularly haunting. That Chinese doctor that tried to spread word of the COVID-19 virus and who later succumbed to it after being harassed by police. Li Wenlang. Agreed. It's a shame he doesn't know what a brave thing he did. Eva Cassidy. She sadly passed away from cancer at 33 in 1993 and wasn't widely recognized until after her tragic death. Amazing voice, her version of Fields of Gold will always be one of my favorite songs. Amazing voice. From everything I've read about Eva, she was terribly shy and not at all interested in being famous, so I think she would be floored to see how popular her music became after her death. William Henry Harrison. He'd be surprised to learn how much we mock his presidency. He didn't screw up anything. Lovecraft would probably be surprised, followed by a heart attack from seeing how much the world has changed. Dude was not really a fan of change. To be fair, he wasn't a fan of a lot of things. Emily Dickinson. There are better answers on here, but she's the first one that came to mind. Only ever published about 0.7% of her body of work, like 12 poems, during her lifetime. The other 1800 poems were discovered and published by her family posthumously. 12 upon 1800 is 0.006, which would round to 0.007, but that is actually 0.7%, not 0.007%. Otherwise, yeah, good candidate. Bob Ross. He had no idea when he died how huge of an impact his legacy was going to make. Everyone knows who Bob Ross is, non-artists and artists of all types. He is a cultural icon and his paintings would be worth millions if Bob Ross Incorporation actually sold his work. But they don't believe Bob would have liked that. He was just sit in it for the joy of painting. Such a cool dude. I'm so glad that they're not selling them and being true to his character. Van Gogh, maybe. That's what I was thinking. He only sold one painting. We're lucky his brother helped him. I would love to see Anne Frank come back to life and her reaction to what happened. Well, at least nowadays she could get a therapist. Joan of Arc, Vlad the Impaler, Peg and Whistle, everyone from the Salem witch trials. H.P. Lovecraft. He died poor and alone. I think he'd be surprised to see his influence in almost all modern horror stories and films, Adventure Time even. Sacagawea. Imagine finding out they put your face on a coin for helping some white boys not die in nature. My favorite one in the whole thread. Cliff Burton. Metallica was big when he died, but I doubt he had any clue just how massive they'd become. He'd definitely say something about those guys being such tools now, and probably wonder why they never kicked Lars out of the band.